Welcome to Trulyfit, the online fitness marketplace connecting pros and clients through unique fitness business software.
Eric, thank you so much for joining the Trulyfit Podcast. Why don't you give my listeners and the audience a little background on who you are, what it is you do, your intellectual pursuits, and then maybe quickly talk about your book and your podcast.
I'm happy to, Steve. Thanks. My name is Eric Brotman. I'm the CEO of BFG Financial Advisors in suburban Maryland, so an East Coaster. Been in this business almost 30 years and have built a company on the basis that the key to financial freedom begins with financial literacy and then financial planning. So we have created programs called Financial Planning for All that reaches out to folks at every end of the economic spectrum and have worked with multi-generational families for years. And it's been a labor of love. And so I'm still, I think of myself as a young man. I think I got a nice long runway in front, but I also have some terrific partners and other advisors here as well. So that's been great. The book, Don't Retire, Graduate, is my third book. It came out now 3 years ago. It came out during the pandemic, so there was no book tour. The timing of it was wretched, but the book was well received. And it is basically taking all of the steps of building a financial plan and building them almost like it was a college curriculum, so that each chapter is a course, for lack of a better word. I don't believe in homework, but love extra credit. So each course ends with an extra credit assignment, and that becomes a workbook. And folks who work through this will wind up with their own financial plan, whether they decide to implement that with a professional or to do it on their own.
I really enjoyed your book, and I love you give a lot of actionable suggestions, but there's a lot of analogies to college, right? Hence the title of the book and your podcast. Yeah. And I really like those analogies, but I feel like in the process, and you hit on this sort of in the freshman year part of the book, but in the process of college, you have all these people surrounding you. You have friends, you have advisors, hopefully you have parents, and you have community, and they're all helping guide you towards this one specific goal of getting into a particular college, right? Wherein you're kind of left in no man's land sometimes when you're dealing with your finances. You would hope that people have financial advisors and things like this, or parents who could teach them, but a lot of people are kind of left out on their own, and they're scared to get what's called financially naked. How do you get through that psychological barrier to have people reach out and to talk to people like you?
It's a great question, and we do tell folks that the process of financial planning and working with a firm like ours is almost as intimate as medicine. And I will joke, you use the term financially naked. I'll joke that there's no one-size-fits-all gown that you have to wear. There's no disrobing. But you are going to be very transparent with your financial lives. And sometimes that means things that are qualitative most of the time, because the math is easy. And I don't say that to think I'm the smartest guy in the room, but the math itself is arithmetic. The hard part is the qualitative stuff, the things that make each family situation unique. It's the health or age of their parents. It's the situation with their kids and their education or their special needs or other things that affect them. It's their job situation. It's their marital situation. It's 100 factors that are not necessarily assigned to numbers that require that input. I mean, if you show me two 40-year-olds making the same amount of money, but one of them is married with 4 kids and one of them is a bachelor, I will show you two very different financial plans. I'm not saying one's better or worse. They're just going to be completely different because their lives are so different, even though they're at the certain age, certain gender, certain background. They could be in the same zip code. So to me, the part of this that makes sense is making it a story. You talked about the fact that I like to use analogies. I try and paint a picture. I try to provide stories and examples for folks because, let's face it, sitting down and talking about finances is both daunting and in some cases boring. I love it. It's what I do all day. But some people would rather get a root canal than talk about their 401k statement. So, I have to work with folks where they are, and the people who really want to know how the watch works, I want to go under the hood with them. Yeah. But for people who just want to know what time it is and don't want to have to do it themselves, we can help those folks too.
That's a great point. And we have to do that in fitness as well. Sometimes I have to simplify things. I have people who come into me who, let's say, make a lot of decisions on their day-to-day basis. Maybe they're physicians, maybe they're financial advisors, and they come into me and they want to turn their brain off. I don't care how this works, Steve. You don't have to tell me which muscles are firing. Give me a good workout. I trust that you know what you're doing. And there's other people who ask a million questions. They want to know all the little nuances of what I do and how it's helping them. And I have to be willing to adjust accordingly and give them what they want to help them succeed.
Yeah, no, I don't want to talk biceps and triceps, and I certainly don't want to talk synovial fluid. Let's just work out. And I liken financial planning a lot to the gym, because there's nothing in financial planning, for the most part, that you can't do yourself. And there's very few things in fitness that you can't do yourself. I know how to do a sit-up, but if I don't have somebody barking at me to drop and give them 20, I might not. And so the accountability partner is, I think, what makes that resonate with so many folks. I have a trainer who's going to be at my house in 3-4 hours, and he's going to beat my tail. And I could do that myself, but I won't. And I know I won't. So I rely on professionals to help me in that regard.
That's a great point. Even if you could, let's go ahead and say you did do it on your own. Eventually, here and there, you want someone to audit what you're doing. So even if I am handling my own finances, let's say, or you're handling your own exercise, you still have to admit to yourself, you're not the utmost expert, right? You know enough, but you need that expert to come in and say, you know what, you're doing this, this, and this right. I would tweak this. And then you go back on your own.
Yeah. And where mistakes happen, the mistakes are amplified. When you're doing 3 or 4 things right, but you do one wrong, you can mess up the things you've done right. No, and so that analogy stays true. If you're working every muscle group exactly right, but you pull a hamstring, there's going to be a lot you can't do. And so financially, it's the same. It's missing the iceberg. It's knowing that this is a process. It's a lifelong process. It's a journey, and it's more important to miss the big mistakes or the emotional reactions or the one black swan event that really hurts you. It's more important to miss that than it is to sort of catch and keep up with the Joneses along the way. That really doesn't matter in the end.
In your book, you have a lot of what I would call like zoom out sort of macro ideologies and philosophies, and then you have a lot of specifics, right? Some zoom in things. This is what you should do specifically to help yourself in debt or whatever situation you're in. But I wanted to talk about first is diversification. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. For us who are not in your industry, we just typically think of, bonds and stocks, right? I'm diversified now, but I assume it's a lot more intricate than that. Can you unpack it?
Yeah, there are half a dozen types of diversification that our work will involve. One will be asset allocation diversification, and that's taking your traditional asset classes, which to your point is stocks, bonds, and I would add cash to that. Stocks, bonds, and cash, and saying there's your simple traditional. But then there are asset classes beyond that make sense in some portfolios. It could be private equity, it could be private debt, it could be real estate, it could be commodities or natural resources or managed futures. It could be a lot of different things. They're not for everyone, but understanding when to use those things, when to pull each lever makes sense. But that's only one kind of diversification. You also want to diversify your type of accounts. You don't want to have all your money, for example, in your 401k and no place else, because it creates a different kind of diversification problem, which is a tax diversification problem. So if all your money's in the same kind of account and it's all subject to the same tax regime, you'll have no flexibility when Congress, 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, when it's your turn to make withdrawals, when Congress changes the rules and some of them are really adverse for a period of time, you'll have no flexibility. You'll be victim of that game. And so it's important to have some capital gains property. It's important to have places where you will never get taxed again on a dollar. I mean, I think there are 4 places where most Americans can put money where it's never taxed again if it's used properly. And I think that's incredibly powerful, because I don't know about you, but I don't expect tax rates in this country to go down. This isn't a political statement. It's that the government is largely broke. We're spending money that we don't have. And rates are kind of at all-time lows right now. There's only one way to go. And so if taxes are going to be higher later, you want to make sure some of your income isn't taxable.
That's great information. And I think, I also compare health and fitness to finance all the time. One of the things I talk about is there's a cost to everything. In fitness, there's a structural cost, right? What am I doing to my body at that given time? But there's also a benefit cost. So what sort of calories am I burning, right? But we have to understand that structural cost can be too much sometimes. You want to look a certain way. You want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You want to look like Ronnie Coleman. Well, guess what? They're paying the price with injuries down the road, right? There was a structural cost to what they were doing, not just a positive metabolic cost. And in finance, that seems to be the case too, right? You see these people who make a lot of money, but they're putting it in the wrong places and they're using it too much, or it's not diversified, as you would say, right? It's all in one area, as opposed to saying, I want to have the most money when I'm the most capable of using it. I need to take care of myself from a health standpoint and from a fiscal standpoint so that I can go into retirement. I can walk around Rome and not be in a wheelchair when I'm 75.
They're very much aligned. I've done a talk for audiences called the 3 Secrets to the Happiest Retirees. And it's nice that there are only three because people can typically remember what they are. And the first one is to be debt-free. And by debt-free, I don't mean you have no debt. I mean you have no adverse debt. It's one thing to have a mortgage on your home or a business loan or something that's collateralized where you're making money by utilizing your capital. That's fine, but as a rule, consumer debt is always bad debt. So if you're carrying a balance on Visa, I don't care why, it's never a good thing. It might be a necessity in your world. It happens. We all have been there. I've been there too. But it's not good debt. So being debt-free is number one. The second is taking care of yourself physically. It's being healthy. And there's only so many things that we can do as financial advisors to help people keep healthy. That requires other folks. It requires medical professionals. It includes your acupuncturist and your massage therapist and your trainers and all the folks who help keep you healthy, your nutritionists, all these folks. And it doesn't mean you have to hire them all. It just means you have to be aware of what they're doing. You have to take care of your health or nothing else is going to matter. You can be wildly wealthy, but if you're unable to move, you're not going to enjoy yourself. And then the third thing is to have a purpose, to have a reason to get out of bed every morning. And so when you look at these three things, only one of them is quantitative. It's the debt piece. The other two are qualitative. It's take care of yourself. You can't wake up one day when you're 70 and decide you're going to get in shape. I mean, I guess you could, but it's not the best plan. It's better to stay healthy all along. It's easier to stay healthy than to get healthy. And I would argue it's the same way with wealth. It is much easier to stay wealthy than it is to get wealthy. So you might as well build a track to run on there. And having a purpose means you're not going from 50, 60, 70 hours a week to Oprah and shuffleboard. You have to have a reason to get out of bed every morning or people stop doing it. And the crossword puzzle is not enough. You've got to have volunteer work. It could be spirituality. It could be all kinds of philanthropy. It could be consulting or part-time work. It could be writing. It could be anything. But figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And Steve, I don't know about you, but most people don't get asked that after they're about 7.
Yeah.
And I love looking at somebody 82 years old and saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they look at me funny. I said, well, you do have some more living to do, right? Is there anything else you want to do? And it's more than a bucket list. A bucket list to me is a starting point, but it's not great because if you say these are the 10 things I want to do or see and then you're done, what do you check out? To me, that's not enough. It's about a purpose and a passion.
That's a great point. I want to actually talk about all three of those things you just named, but first I want to go back to another reason why health and finances overlap so much is like sort of the Warren Buffett compounding thing that works for your 401k. Let's say it works almost in an inverse relationship in health, and I'll unpack that. Is that the more you stick with your health, the less time you have to spend on your health moving forward, right? So that 70-year-old just said, hey, let's get in shape. If they haven't been working out for the last 30 years, they're going to have to put a lot of time and energy and effort into that, right? Because they're behind the 8 ball, so to speak. That person has been working out their entire life, doesn't have to do as much, right? Because they're already maintaining this flow. So again, just another crossover that matters so much for people who are looking to, again, have the most money in the late in life and be able to use that money in the proper ways. But let's go back to number one here. You talked about debt. Talk about the different kinds of debt. Let's say someone didn't read your book. They got in a bad, sticky situation here, credit card debt compared to student loan debt, and how we would handle those different things.
Right now is a very interesting time in our history because we have been in a downwardly trending interest rate market for almost 40 years. So there is what we're experiencing now in the United States and around the world with inflation and with higher interest rates. It's the first time most generations, half the population, has ever seen it, which is kind of unique because you would expect there'd be ebbs and flows along the way. But this is really new for a lot of folks. For people who are Gen Xers and Boomers who bought their first home and might have been paying 13 or 14% on a mortgage, and then were excited when they got to refinance it to 9.5%. People complaining about 6 and 7 right now sounds silly. But if you grew up only knowing 2 and 3% interest rates and now it's 7, that's hard. So with debt, what tends to happen is people forget that it's not only the amount of money you're borrowing, but it's the impact on your cash flow of having to carry that debt. And the United States is a perfect example. Our debt service is a huge piece of our budget. Well, your family budget should not look like that. We can't print money in our basements. I mean, I guess we could, but we really shouldn't. So you're not supposed to do that. But because you can't print money, it means you have to use those resources properly. And to me, if you're borrowing money to invest in something that is likely to make more money than it costs you. That's arbitrage, that's leverage, that's okay. For example, if you're taking a small business association loan to create a company, and you've got a business plan and you've got people helping you and you're going to start a company, that's an investment. It's a legitimate investment. It's a legitimate reason to borrow money. There are situations with student loans, because student loans are a really sticky wicket. Student loans, in theory, make sense. In theory, it means you borrow so you can get an education, so you can have a larger income, so you can pay your loan back and then be better off in the end. The problem is it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah.
And I think you have to look at an ROI. You have to look at return on investment before you take a student loan. Are you going to be a structural engineer or a poet? And, and I'm not disparaging liberal arts. In fact, I'm a liberal arts grad myself and loved it. But there are certain majors and certain plans of study that don't necessarily earn back what you've borrowed. And then that becomes kind of a lousy investment. Even if it enriches you in lots of ways, now might not be the time. You can go back and study something later in life when you have the resources to do it. Car notes. Generally, I would love to see folks not have a car payment. But if you must have a car payment because you have to get to work and you have to commute to work and driving to work is what's going to pay the bills, then that can be, at least in the short term, an investment. Credit cards, basically always out. Credit cards are the greatest invention ever if you pay them in full, because they give you free stuff. And the reason they give you free stuff is because companies that accept credit cards have to give the credit card company a piece of everything they bring in that way. So these aren't freebies, but they're free to the consumer. So if you use a credit card for everything and you're collecting airline miles or cash back or any of these various things and you use them, that's great. But if you carry a balance, you are defeating the purpose of having that type of account. Carrying a balance on a credit card is like a noose. It strangles you, and it's not okay. Other kinds of debt. Mortgage debt. I tend to think mortgage debt is reasonably good debt. If you're buying a home and you expect that home over time will appreciate more than the loan will cost you. At 2 and 3%, that's obvious. At 14%, that's questionable. At 7%, you really have to think about it. Like, what is the stability of the neighborhood? How long are you going to be there? Because I think there's almost taboo in older generations about renting. But there's something to be said for renting.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not rooted in a community, if you don't have all your family in one place, if your job might mean that you need to move in 3 years. Buying a house and selling it quickly, I don't care what the market's doing, is not a good plan because it costs a lot to buy, it costs a lot to move, it costs a lot to sell. So I think it is a case-by-case piece. I don't think there's such a thing as good debt or bad debt categorically, with probably the exception of credit cards, because it means you bought something you can't afford. That
was a great rundown, and I liked how you said at the end that that there's a big difference between the different types of debt. But specifically, I want to go to the housing, because that's what's in vogue right now. People are talking about interest rates that shot through the roof. But like you said, comparatively speaking to what it was at one particular time, they're not necessarily high. But is there a number? Is there a number where Eric says, I would not buy a house regardless of the market, regardless of my current fiscal goals, if that percentage was too high?
The short answer is no, not as a rule of thumb. But again, it comes down to your situation. If you're planning to buy a home that you expect to spend the next 20 or 30 years in, and interest rates happen to be high, as long as you can comfortably afford the payment, there will be opportunities, whether it's in a year or 2 or 5, to refinance at a lower rate. Interest rates are not likely to go up and stay up indefinitely. They ebb and they flow. So if you can afford the debt service, if you can afford the payment, and if you're going to move to your forever home, that's great. If it's a starter home, if it's your first home, and costs are especially high, and you're not 100% sure that this is where you're going to wind up because maybe you haven't met your future spouse yet, you don't have children, you don't know if you're going to or not, there's a lot of flux in your life, I would tell people to wait. There's a glut of apartments in this country, and I know rents have gone up, and they have because of supply and demand, but there's still a glut. There's too many apartments and not enough renters in a lot of markets, which means that even where rents have gone up, it often is more affordable to rent than to buy. And I know people love to own a home, but the reasons to own a home are not usually financial. They're emotional. They're psychological. It's your nest. It's your place. This is ours. Most people don't own their homes outright. And in fact, even if they do, if there's no debt on them and they have no mortgage at all, some people can't afford to stay in their homes in retirement anyway because of the real estate taxes and the maintenance. Yeah. Or they haven't taken your advice and they can't walk the stairs anymore. I mean, there's reasons why people can't stay in their homes. So figuring that out and understanding the nuances specific to your situation matters more than just what's the number. The number, there's no rule of thumb that for me is comfortable. It's like that hospital gown we talked about. One size may fit all, but it's not flattering on any of us.
You know, a lot of people in the health and fitness industry lie about whether it's the exercise that they're doing or their food to their trainer, right? They say, this is what I'm doing. We have to kind of audit exactly what's going on. We have to write it out. And for me, what I found, and you know, I want your take on this, is the benefit from a house that one says they get is usually always over exaggerated, right? So like I have older people in my life, I'm not going to name them, who say, oh, I made X amount of dollars after selling my house. It's like, okay, well, you replaced the air condition. You had to mow the lawn all the time. You're not adding in all of these other externalities that are interconnected with this house, including inflation, right? So yeah, you bought it at this, you sold it at this, but it's 15 years later. So what about the actual inflation resolved around there? And I think that's a big sort of disconnect with people in houses.
I'm careful not to use the word always or never very often.
Yeah.
But I will say in the never column, never look at your primary residence as an investment. It's not. It's a nest. It's a place to live. If you're buying real estate as rental property, then you can quantifiably measure whether this is a cash flow positive or negative, whether it's a good investment. It's never a good investment to own your own home because, to your point, the HVAC, the roof, the driveway, the lawn, the whatever, it is a money pit. I don't care if it's new construction or a house from the 1860s that you find somewhere. It's always a money pit. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I own a home. I love my home. But it has, and it's appreciated since I bought it. And it still has been a loser in terms of dollars and cents. And it always will be.
Student debt. How did we get here? Go.
We got here. Oh boy, I don't know how political I can get on your show. I'm going to try not to. We got here because college became something that everyone was expected to do. And if you go back to the 1950s, which thankfully was before my time, but I've studied a little. If you go back to the 50s, not everybody finished high school. There were people who finished high school and people who didn't. They went out and they worked in various, often blue-collar settings. Fast forward, the folks then in the 50s who finished high school sort of had a leg up. They had an advantage. And if you fast forward to, say, the 70s or 80s, where college was becoming more prevalent, and certain jobs were now becoming more and more white collar, more computerized, especially the 80s, 90s. Now a college degree was considered an entry ticket to a better life. Mm-hmm. And so the percentage of folks who went to college, which wasn't super high, those folks were the doctors and lawyers and accountants and architects. And so there was a reason to do this. Fast forward to today, where a huge percentage of the population goes to school, often not really knowing what they want to study. I would argue that high schools, for lots of reasons, but one of them was No Child Left Behind. High schools are not pushing, we're not teaching what we used to in high schools. In fact, if I can dare be funny for a minute, 100 years ago in high schools in this country, we were teaching how to translate Latin into Greek, and now we're teaching kids not to eat Tide Pods. So a lot has happened in a short period of time. But the college education, it's really almost grades 13 to 16.
Yeah.
And I'm a college graduate, and I've been a trustee at a university, and I'm a big fan of higher education. There has to be a reason for it. And so where we are today, everyone feels like they have to go, which does two things. One, it raises the price because there's more demand for the service. So the price goes up, and it's gone up a lot, unfettered. But two, it also reduces the value of the degree because so many people have them. So if all that demand for an undergraduate education in whatever major is there, you have raised the price and reduced the value. And when that pendulum swings too far, it's not worth going. And so, I happen to think that learning is more of a lifelong endeavor than it ever was. this idea that you're going to know everything you need to know by 22 is farce anyway.
Yeah.
If you show me a lawyer who hasn't been in school in 40 years, and I'll show you someone I'm not hiring. So,
Touché.
So make sure you're on the cutting edge. That means going back to school. It means grad school. It means continuing education. It means doing things to enrich yourself. And by the way, the current generation changes jobs every 3 to 5 years, and not just jobs, industries. So if you go to school for accounting and you get an accounting degree and a big loan, and then you go and you work for an accounting firm for a few years and you decide you hate accounting, and what you really want to do is be a therapist, it's a totally different academic pursuit. It requires a whole nother investment in education to shift gears.
Sure.
And you really can't get a return on undergraduate education the way you could. Graduate, I disagree. Graduate, in the right programs, a master's degree in certain things makes sense. Although I think the MBA is almost worthless now. I do. I think it is an almost worthless degree. It's an excuse to spend 2 more years and $100,000 to not actually experience the world. And there's other master's degrees, masters in education, which are required in most cases by teachers. Really is putting a lot of pressure and creating a situation where we have fewer good teachers than we could simply because of that academic hurdle. A master's in social work, to me, I don't understand. No. Not because social work isn't great and we need those people, and I'm so glad people do it. But does it require a graduate degree? And all that tuition? I don't know.
Yeah, I almost think that, this could be controversial, but college should be less specific. And what I mean by that is like sort of like a St. John's, just reading the great books and understanding some concepts and ideas so that when you do change jobs, which is almost inevitable for some of these people, yep, they have a greater understanding, right? The Plutarch quote, the mind is not a vessel to be filled, but fire to be kindled. We have to teach people how to think. And why it's important to think and why it's important to read but then there's the other end of the spectrum where there's a whole subset of people who should just be going to technical schools.
Absolutely.
Right? So and they need to be guided that way. I think there was a cultural thing. My parents' generation who were born in the 50s, it was they were pushing everyone right towards college. You have to go to college. You have to go to college. Have to go to college because for them, college was the difference between success and not, and they assumed that was going to be for their children. They couldn't forecast properly, but that wasn't the case necessarily. I have 5 best men at my wedding. Only one of them had to actually go to college. He's currently a lawyer. The rest of them all graduated from college and work currently in jobs that have nothing to do with college. So there was a cultural aspect, but you can correct me if I'm wrong here. I think the one thing you didn't mention, and I'm sure you know something about this, is at some point though, the way people were funded via loans to go to college had changed, right? So in the 50s and 60s and 70s, maybe even into the 80s, you were getting private loans, where now when you have government-backed loans, the prices can obviously go up because of the fact they're backed by the government. Is that correct?
There's some truth to that for sure. And the cash was so ample, it was being thrown at people. And you're talking about folks who were allowed when they weren't old enough to have a Budweiser, they were allowed to sign on the dotted line and borrow 6 figures to get an undergraduate degree. Yeah. They might not even qualify for a credit card yet and couldn't have a beer. They can't even vote yet, but they can borrow that kind of money and have their parents co-sign on it. And to me, all of that free money, kids can't make that decision. And I know there are exceptions. And so if you're one of those exceptions, I apologize in advance. But when I was 18 years old, I was not making good financial decisions. I barely knew which building history was in. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, I don't understand how we would allow young people to make what could be crippling financial decisions at such a young age and have basically no consequence. And by the way, you can't declare bankruptcy and get rid of a student loan. So the government rigged this game in such a way that they'll give you all the money you want, but you will pay it back, and you can't get out of it any way in any way. And now you're essentially an indentured servant to the government for what could be 30 years after you graduate. That's nuts.
It's nuts. I have a theory with no evidence, but I'm going to unpack it here, and you can tell me what you think.
Okay.
That person who goes to college, let's say it's Steve. I go to college. I have way too much debt. I graduate in German dance theory. And I have nowhere to use this. I am $120,000 in debt. So what I do is I continue to, let's say, live my life. I move to a city. I get a job that is paying me I don't know, $40,000 a year. I'm not able to actually pay off my loans. The interest has continued to go up, so that I don't want to get married because I don't actually have the money to start a family or buy a house and live the American dream. So I kick that can down the road. Maybe I don't get married until I'm 35 or 40 and I have less debt. And because of this, though, those dynamics, not having a family early like people did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, actually leads you to not save. Because when you have a kid, you obviously want to save for their future, but also in addition, I tell this story to people. I thought I was going to go on vacation with my child, but I was just watching my child in a different city. So like you're not as apt to go take vacations and do these things and spend this amount of money because it's just easier to be at home. And because that has changed now, that people aren't saving, and it's sort of like this cycle that all connects with how our finances are used today.
I liken it in the book to the airplane safety lecture. When they say, in the event of loss of cabin pressure, masks will drop down. Please secure your own mask before you secure it for your child, which, by the way, thankfully I've never been in that situation, but I can only imagine how hard that would be because you'd give both your kidneys for your kid, right?
Sure.
But nonetheless, the advice is sound. If you don't help yourself, you can't help him or her because you're passed out, right?
Yeah.
Well, financially speaking, I've seen families who nearly bankrupt themselves to educate their kids. And whether it's private schools or whether it's college or whether it's even paying for grad school for these kids. And at some point, what I say is you're going to have some really educated kids. Which one do you plan to live with? And I'm not joking because they're not saving for retirement. So the only thing in this life you can't borrow for is financial independence. It's retirement. You can borrow for anything else. You can borrow for real estate or business or education or healthcare if you had to. You can borrow for anything. You cannot borrow for retirement. There are only 3 sources of money that are available, period, when it comes to retirement. One is people at work, which means you don't retire. You continue to earn a paycheck. One is money at work, which means your money is making money, which allows you to live a certain way. And the other is charity. Whether it's asking your kids or your parents or your neighbor or the church for money, or whether it's government handouts, you can't support yourself. If you're not working and you don't have money at work, you're a charity case, period.
The one thing we do know when looking at sort of like economics and forecasting is demographics are basically, they are what they are. Everybody who is 30 today is going to be 50 in 20 years. That's just a fact, or they won't be here anymore.
Right. I was going to say, not everybody. Some of them won't be here, but okay.
Won't be here. But yeah. So because with the ability to kind of look at that, and I'm not telling you that I'm not making you forecast here exactly, but knowing you did an episode on talking on your podcast a little bit about Social Security, and you don't have to go sort of in depth here, but if you just stay high level, what problems could we potentially see coming down the road with Social Security?
Well, Social Security in and of itself is the largest Ponzi scheme ever created. And what I mean by that is it requires everyone to keep paying in so other people can pull out. The idea that it is your money that you've paid into the system and that your employer is matched into the system and that you can then collect is not really true. If you had your own Social Security account, which has been floated by various administrations over the years, that would be different. That would be, yes, you're forced to put some money in and there's a match, but it's your money. In this case, what it really is Robin Hood. The more you put into the system as a percentage, the less likely you are to get out of it. It is designed horribly. It was designed at a time when there were a lot more workers for every retiree because people didn't live that long. And it was designed at a time when 72 was old. So you work from 18 to 65 because you work from 18 because you're not in college. You're getting a job. You're working from 18 to 65. You retire and you're dead at 72. Which means that you work for almost 50 years to have a 7-year retirement pool, which is math that will work all day long. Well, today people enter the workforce at 23, 24, 25. To your point, they're $100,000 in the hole, so they're not actually saving anything, despite the fact they're getting some Social Security. They'd like to retire when they're 55 because they've been hearing about the FIRE movement, and they could live to be 106. The math won't work. It can't work. And so I do think Social Security will change. I think it will change to be means tested, which means people over a certain income level will have their benefits reduced in some way or even eliminated. They've already done these kinds of things with Medicare. With Medicare, if you have the nerve to have an income, you have to pay more for your Medicare. You're literally paying more for something you've already paid for, which is horrifying. And Social Security was supposed to be, if you look at your paycheck, I don't know if you're a W-2 employee, but if you are, you get a paycheck. And on your paycheck, it doesn't say Social Security. It says OASDI, Old Age and Survivor Disability Income. It was for people who were extremely elderly. 62 is when you can start pulling. I don't know about you. I'm closer to 62 than I ever imagined I'd be, and I don't feel elderly. So it was designed for the incredibly frail, super elderly population, and now it's really for almost everybody, and it can't last. I do think they'll eliminate the wage base at some point. The wage base, for those who don't know, is the fact that you pay Social Security, but only up to a certain amount of income each year, and then you don't have to pay anymore because your benefits don't accrue anymore. It'll be easy politically to raise or eliminate that base and start collecting more from high-income earners, and I fully expect that that'll happen. I'm not a fan, but I fully expect it'll happen. And then I expect some means testing in terms of who actually collects, and that in the same way that your Medicare premiums might be 4 and 5 times what they are for everybody else, if you have an income, you're, I think, going to wind up getting less of your Social Security than you would have, which means you paid the most into it and as a percentage got the least out of it.
And you don't think they'll bump the age back because that's too difficult from a logistics standpoint, because then you're telling one part of the population you just missed it by a day, maybe?
I could solve Social Security in about 8 minutes with a yellow pad if I wasn't running for office. The problem is if you're not running for office, you don't get a vote. Social Security age should be a lot higher than it is. With some, and if it were up to me, and I'm, like I said, not running for office, but Social Security age would be 75 or 80 because that's what it was really designed to be. And for people in jobs where you literally physically can't do it beyond a certain age, I could see us having some type of parameters to allow them into the system early. I mean, it's different. If you're pushing paper versus digging ditches, you have a very different physical aspect of your life. And I don't want airline pilots at 78. You know what I mean? There's certain careers where it would be better if that didn't happen, I think, in most cases. So I do think that the age should be much higher, but that there should be some way to collect sooner based on what you've done for a living. And that can become a bipartisan or nonpartisan thing. The problem is, as soon as you mention, I'm going to raise the Social Security age, even if it was by a week, you're dead in the water. Because your political opponents will say, they're coming for your Social Security. You paid for this. You deserve, and you're dead. So until and unless both parties say the system's either going to disappear or we're going to have to fix it, it won't get fixed. And that won't happen until it's the very last minute.
And if the system disappeared, you don't expect the sky to start falling, right? This would be a pretty, I assume the first few years would be tough, but given that people can now invest their own money rather than put it into Social Security, I would think that we would recover from this. Or no, do you not believe that?
We would never recover from it because there's an entire swath of the population north of 50% who rely on this as almost their only source. And the only way I think to do it, if you were going to get rid of it, is to say anybody turning 21 right now no longer participates, and so that you're not taking it away from anyone who's already really paid into it.
Sure.
The problem with that is if you don't have new money coming in, but you have lots of money coming out, it's not going to work either. So the math is really almost impossible. There are too few working people and too many retirees. And the reason that happened isn't because people aren't working, although we know about the quiet quitting thing. It's not because people aren't working. It's because people aren't dying at 72. They're living to 82 and 92 and 102 and 112. And, annuity companies now have changed their age and life insurance companies have changed the age for their mortality tables to be 125, which sounds absurd. But when they changed it to 100 50 years ago, that sounded absurd too. So I don't know. Am I going to be 117 and wondering where my Social Security check is? Will I have collected for 50 years? I doubtful. There aren't enough personal trainers to get me to 117, my friend.
We could try our best, but I rather fix that problem, try to get you to 117, than fix the Social Security problem.
Yeah, well, fair. I'll do the Social Security if you get me to 117. How's that?
That was one of your office hour episodes. Another one that you did was talking a little bit about, which I have to think about a lot now, is dealing with your child and finances and how you're going to teach your child about finances. I think it's, all families learn differently. My wife came from maybe a household that was a little bit more strict and budgety with her money. So she is rather than I am. And it's just interesting how people go through that. Yeah. And allowance is always a conversation. We don't have to worry about it now. My daughter's only 18 months, but eventually we are going to have to worry about it. How do you think allowance should be used so that it's advantageous for the family and the child?
I will tell you how we used it. And I will also tell you my daughter's 13 and no longer receives it. Okay. Because what I really thought was a great plan was great until it wasn't anymore, and then it didn't work anymore. And so here's sort of the way it played out in our house. Our daughter approached us. She was, I think, 8 or 9 years old and said, I'd really like to earn an allowance. And I'm glad she used the word earn because I wanted it to be earned, not given. And so my wife and I talked about it, and we said, well, let's find some age-appropriate things that our daughter can do around the house to help out to warrant that quid pro quo, if you will. And we came up with a few things, and I said, all right. I said, I'm going to give you $5 a week if you do these things. And it was things like emptying the dishwasher or cleaning your room or simple stuff, putting your clothes away. I said, I'm going to give you $5 a week, but I need you to go to a craft store. We took her to a craft store. She bought 3 jars, and she labeled those jars. And the jars were labeled fun, charity, and long-term. And so every week I gave her 5 $1 bills. I said, the deal is you have to put 1 in charity, you have to put 1 in long-term, and you can put the other 3 anywhere you want. And it became a lesson. And for several years, this worked really, really well, where I would see in the beginning all the money went to fun. And then she realized she had fun money. She didn't really need it. She wasn't using it. So she started putting more into long-term and more into charity. At the end of each year, the first year, I took her to the bank. I introduced her to the branch manager. We made a deposit, created an account for her, made a deposit, which I matched because there was some benefit to understanding the match concept. You've grown this because she was only getting a penny of interest, on the little account. We also went online and we found a couple of charities that were things that spoke to her. One was related to kids, sick kids, and one was related to animals. Made perfect sense. I made a donation in both our names, matched the donation, also like a company match type of thing. Sure. So that she was getting correspondence saying, thank you for your help. This made a difference and so forth. So she was learning philanthropy. She was learning savings, and she was having fun money. The reason this plan ultimately failed, first of all, is because as you get into middle school, and you don't know this with an 18-month-old, but when you get into middle school, the rigors of your day and the length of your day and the amount of homework and the amount of extracurriculars and the amount of stuff means there's going to be a lot you're not doing around the house. And it sort of took a back seat. And then you get in that conversation of, you didn't put your clothes away this week, so no allowance, and you actually can do more harm than good. So we just stopped it entirely. She wants for nothing. We're blessed in so many ways. She wants for nothing, but she also knows that she has this bank account that she could use if she wanted to, and she got a couple of gifts over the holidays this past year, and she asked me to put the money in her bank, which I did, which I thought was great. They were Amazon gift cards. And rather than spending money on something she didn't want, I bought them from her, and she put the money in the bank. So I thought there was a good lesson there. So I would say allowance should be earned, not given. And I would say you have to know your kid. I mean, some kids will be excited about it and say, Dad, for an extra $10, I'll mow the lawn. And some kids are going to say, well, I don't feel like doing that. And you'll have to decide. I mean, you've got some time. But I think learning philanthropy, learning the value of $1. I mean, we went to dinner last week, 2 weeks ago, and she saw the cost of dinner for $3 and was shocked. And I said to her, I said,
I'm shocked too.
Oh, well, right now it's especially crazy. But I said, look, I want you to find something to do for your life that makes you incredibly happy. I hope it also pays you well because you like to go out to dinner and you like to do these things, and you won't be able to do these things unless you find something to do that you both enjoy and will help you make a living. And I think that resonated. We'll see. I mean, right now she's into the arts. If she goes into the arts, she will have lots of fun but not make a lot of money, and that ultimately that's okay too. I want her to be happy more than I want anything else in the world. But I'm hoping that she'll learn some of those lessons that if you want some of the finer things, you must work for them. They don't just fall in your lap.
Eric, this has been fantastic information. Let my audience know where they can find you, your book, your podcast, and any other places you're at.
The book and podcast are at brotmanmedia.com. They're called Don't Retire, Graduate. You can find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of the various podcast platforms. Our financial planning business is at bfgfa.com. We are BFG Financial Advisors, so bfgfa.com. And we'd love to talk to you. There's a lot of information on our website. There are some free white papers, information on how to pay less in taxes, how to involve financial wellness into your corporate plan if you own a company, and what financial planning is and sort of how to hire somebody. So there's a lot of information. I hope your audience will check it out.
And the book is great. We didn't discuss even half of it today, so don't feel as if we went over everything. My guest today has been Eric Brotman. Eric, thank you for joining the Trulyfit Podcast.
Steve, it's been a ton of fun. I look forward to keeping in touch.
Awesome.